Hello, and a good day to each and all of you. Before we begin, please meet the lovely muses of Group 3. Let's go!
This our report, we've got poetry lessons, so full of music, the rhythm of its own design. This is the Group 3, a perfect constellation, so many stars and everybody gets to shine. Whoa! I'll stop singing now.
To everyone present here, our group has worked hard to prepare this presentation where we will be helping you all understand poetry. Specific topics we will be going through will be about poetry as a genre, poetry versus prose, poetry's elements, types, techniques, and literary devices, genres and their types, poetic forms, reading poetry, and of course, writing poetry. We will be providing you all with strategies for reading, analyzing, and writing poetry in ways that reveal the nature, purpose, process of poetry. May you lend us your ears, for we will now go on a journey into the world of poetry. Hi again, my name is Justin Joy B. de la Cruz, and let me start with our report now. Here I will be sharing a specific five-letter word, genre. I believe everyone knows the word genre and the very thoughts it conjures in our heads. People who enjoy reading literary works are already familiar with examples of literary genres. So, what are these literary genres? The four of them are fiction, non-fiction, poetry, and drama. But we won't be talking about every single literary genre in existence for this presentation. We will be focusing on just one specific, and that would be poetry. Poetry is the star of the show today, or reporting to be exact. All of you already have a basic idea of the definition of poetry, but here's a definition I've decided to share with you. Okay, poetry is very much something we hear and think about every day. Scratch that? Probably not, but who knows, maybe one of us is already writing down their haikus or even generating lyrics of a self-made song. Oh ho 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 ho. We all know that poetry is something beautiful, something wonderful and priceless, a redeeming piece for humankind. Most poems that we think are those that rhyme, but there are also those that don't. The structure of poetry has stanzas and lines, they have meters, rhyme schemes, repetition, and a speaker. They are born out of a person's sincerest emotions. They are buried feelings that we coop up inside ourselves and then come out to take the physical form of written or spoken words. Some of you may feel and think that, oh, poetry is too hard, poetry is a bit too intimidating for my taste, or your words, you have to rhyme. Poetry is a bit limited, as you can tell, and poetry has too many rules to follow. Poetry may not be that interesting, but it is confusing and hurts my head to think about. And dear me, poetry is too much pressure, like a drip, drip, drip that'll never stop. Whoa. But, well, poetry is more than just rhymes. Poetry can actually tell stories like those narrative poetries. Poetry can bring laughter and tears with dramatic poetry, and lyric poetry can turn poems into music. Isn't poetry very interesting? Had I already gotten the majority of you hooked on poetry? If I have, I think you'll all be excited about what I will be discussing next, and that is analyzing poetry. Before we entirely proceed to analyzing poetry, there are five things you all need to consider when analyzing poetry. First is the theme. The theme is the very center of a poem. This is a seedling from where a poem begins its life. This is what we should be unearthing from a poem to fully understand what lies beneath these pattern words and what is the meaning behind this structured piece of literature. A theme is the very subject of a poem. Second is language. The language is what creates the tone and mood of the poem. There are many other languages in the world, and the language we are using right now is English. As you all know, other people from around the globe also produce their own poetry in their own language, but we differ in terms of characters used, alphabets, words, pronunciations, and structures, or like the syntax of a language. The arrangement of language in a poem has an effect on the rhythm of a poem. And we have third, sound and rhythm. Poetry is well known for its sound and rhythm. It is honestly like music, but sort of toned down in a way. Like, let me use Robert Frost's well-known poem, The Road Not Taken. This is in the last stanza. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I'm not very sure if I made a very good demonstration there, but as you may have heard from me or from other poem voiceovers, the metrical pattern of a poem is created by the syllabic patterns and stresses that are used. Now we have the fourth, which is the structure. When it comes to structure, you can already picture one. Surely everyone here has already encountered upon a poem and know that a poem is built around stanzas, lines, line breaks, rhyme patterns, punctuation, and pauses, among other elements. And now let's go to context, which is the fifth. In the context, we circulate our thoughts here around who, what, where, when, and why of a poem can all be used to assist explain its meaning and intent. The context is the background of what has influenced the poet in writing the poem. Now that you are well aware of these things that we should consider, let us now hop on into how we can analyze poetry. Number one is read the poem. Read the poem. Again, read the poem. Can anyone tell me, has there ever been a person who never read a poem but was able to analyze it? If there ever is one, I have not thoroughly researched it. But really, can you imagine yourself being able to analyze a poem by just looking at it? Looking is different from reading, because when you read, you go through every word and allow the thoughts to sink in your mind. So again, the first thing you should do in order to analyze a poem, to analyze elements and techniques, you need to read. Read it yourself. Read it in your head. Read it with your eyes. Read it like you mean it. Second is read the poem again, this time aloud. I told you first to read the poem all to yourself. Now, read the poem aloud. Out loud. Use your mouth. Speak up. Let the poem's words and rhythm be voiced out. If you aren't certain of how the rhythm of a poem goes, you can go to the internet and search for recordings you can listen to. But make sure to listen carefully to each line. Hear the rhythm, find the breaks, and locate the stresses. Third is to map out the rhyme scheme. If a poem has a rhyme scheme or is written in free verse, you will notice it. You will be able to if a poem is without a rhyme scheme or if it has a regular meter. Try to create a rhyming pattern by assigning a letter to each line and giving lines that rhyme the same letter. Example, the first line ends with the word play, assign it with an A. Next, you see in the second stanza that the ending word is stress. Now, play and stress don't rhyme, so you put B and not an A. Now then, in the third line, you find the word day. Day and play rhymes, so we will put an A. In the fourth line, it ends with sleepless. See how stress and sleepless rhyme, and yes, you guessed it, we will be putting a B. Look for that pattern. You can also look for a formal rhyme system such as terza rima, which has 3-line stanzas with interconnected scheme of like A, B, C, B. Number 4 is scan the poem. Scansion is a method of analyzing poetry's meter using the pattern of stress and unstressed syllables in each line. We make a note of each foot, which is the basic unit of a poetry line, which consists of one stressed syllable and at least of one unstressed syllable. Next, we make a note of the stress pattern along the line. Using this information, we will locate the meter. A poem written in iambic pentameter, for example, will contain 5 feet and a syllabic pattern of the dum, the dum, the dum, the dum. And there are other more patterns that you can find in other types of poems. Number 5 is break down the structure. We shall take a moment to consider the poem on the page. Take note of the white space that surrounds the words. Poetry is intended to produce a visual as well as emotional impression. We need to examine the structure's details and such as the number of lines in each stanza. Take note of the line breaks. Is it It is true. Is it true that the end of each line corresponds to the end of the thought? If not, the poet may not be employing enjambment, a technique in which one line flows into the next. Number 6 is determine the form of the poem. Note what type of poem you're reading in the poem analysis, depending on the aspects you've looked at. Like a sonnet, for example, is a poetry with 3 quatrains, 4-line stanzas, followed by a couplet. Sestina, haiku, and limerick are examples of formal poetry. Take a moment to consider the poem on the page. Take note of the white space that surrounds the words. Poetry is intended to produce a visual as well as an emotional expression. Examine the structure's details, such as the number of lines in each stanza. Take note of the line breaks. Is it true that the end of each line corresponds to the end of the thought? If not, the poet may be employing enjambment, a technique in which one line flows into the next. Number 7 is to study the language in the poem. Poets choose their words carefully, very, very carefully, when writing their poems. It's not a random guess game where you can just put any word just because they rhyme well together. Examine each word in the line and the poem to see what it means. What role does it play in the story? Look them up if you don't know what they mean. See how the poet uses metaphors, similes, and figurative language to experiment with words. We need to remember to take note of any literary strategies employed to shape the poem's language, such as alliteration and assonance. Number 8 is study the content of the poem. To study, we need to examine the very content and message of the poem. Work through the language in order to discover the topic. From here, we need to understand the historical background of the poem, find out when it was written, determine when and where it was written, as well as the poet's language. This is essential if you want to truly be able to be in line with the author or the poet. If not, if you're reading a translation, look for further variances that reveal how the original work was perceived by different translators. Number 9 is determine who the narrator is. Try to figure out who the poem speaker is. Is it told in the first person, second person, or third person perspective? What is the narrator's voice like? Does the speaker's voice sound happy? Does it sound sad? Does it sound angry? We try to fit ourselves into the speaker's or narrator's shoes. We will base on their personal perspective because the speaker's identity determines how the poem is told. So number 10 is paraphrase the poem line by line. Finally, go over the poem once again. Paraphrase each line, starting with the verse. To put it in another way, interpret the meaning while writing out your summary. After you finish reading the poem, read your words to understand the meaning. Now, remember, we all have different and unique minds, so not everyone will be able to accurately analyze the poem the same way the poet intends. We all go through different experiences and live through different lives. Now that you know all of this, I hope it will be doable enough for each to be able to make their very own analysis on poems or poetry. I guess that will be all for this part of understanding poetry. I am Justin Joy de la Cruz, and thank you for listening.
Hey guys, for today's discussion, I will be discussing about poetry and prose and how they differ to each other. Now, I know that we have tackled this topic several times already because of our subject last semester, but please allow me to refresh the topic into your minds and at least provide a short recap of our discussion about the poetry and prose. So, according to Britannica, poetry is a literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. Imaginative awareness of experience, meaning the poetry came from a person who is expounding his imagination through series of rhetoric words. In the simplest form, poetry is written to share ideas, express emotions, and create imagery. So I know that we are all familiar with the structure of poetry, but I will discuss it anyway so that it can retain in our minds. So the first one is the meter. It imposes specific length and emphasis on a given line of poetry. The second one is the stanza, the unit of poetry composed of lines that relate to a similar thought or topic. Remember that when we are talking about the stanza, it is a whole composition of thought in one poem. And the next one is rhyme scheme, composed of shared vowel sounds or consonants. When we read a poem, we notice that some of the words or most of the words at the end of the line has the same sounds, meaning that they rhyme or complemented each other's sound. The next one is line. The words put together to form a line in a poem. Remember that we cannot create a stanza without the line as it composes the thought of the poem. The next one is the rhythm, the beat in the poem. Rhythm is relative to the meter since it talks about the pattern of the words in the poem. The next one is repetition, a sound, word, or line that is repeated in poem. The last one is the speaker, the one who talks and narrates the poem. Mostly, it is the narrator who talks about the poem or the third person's POV or point of view. Usually, poems are created in the first person point of view and the third person point of view. Prose, however, is a way for writers to communicate with readers in a straightforward, even conversational manner and tone. As we can see, prose comes from the Latin word prosa oratio, meaning straightforward. It simply means language that follows the natural pattern found in everyday speech. It is the most common form of writing used in both fiction and non-fiction. Moving forward, we will now discuss about the difference of prose and poetry. Prose writing tends to be linear. It tends to share clear information generally in a logical order. Prose tends to work in clearer meanings and to be less musical, that is, working with the inherent rhythms and sonic properties of language, and less densely packed with meanings, literary devices, and associations than poetry. Prose is a written work, whereas poetry is a genre of literature. Prose contains sentences and paragraphs and does not have any metrical structure. And poetry, however, is based on a particular form that creates a rhyme.
Hello, good day. I am Rosemary Diet, and I was assigned to discuss the elements of poetry. Speaker. In poetry, the speaker in the poem is the voice that talks to the reader, similar to the narrator in fiction. The poem's speaker is the person who is addressing the reader. When we talk about the audience, an audience is a literary term used to describe for whom a writer is constructing a poem. The audience is meant to find significance in the poem's meaning, and it is the poet's duty to write in a way that will speak to his intended audience. Content. The content is the subject matter of the poem. It answers the question what is the poem all about, what happens in the poem. Theme. The theme of the poem is the meaning of the poem itself, the main idea that the poet is trying to communicate. The theme may be stated or may be implied. Structure. The structure of a poem or a play is the term for the way that all formal elements of a work come together in a single piece of literature. The running over a line or thought into the next line without a strong break or pause. It was the continuation of sentence from one line to another without terminal punctuations. Here is an example excerpt from A Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare. I am not prone to weeping as our sex commonly are, the want of which vain dew. Lines. In end stop lines, there is a pause in the meaning of a poem at the end of the line. In other words, the end of the line coincides with the end of the thought or a pause in the thought. Here is an example. Bright star, would I were as steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with internal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremite. This was the excerpt from Bright Star by John Keats. Caesura. Caesura is the break or pause within a line of poetry indicated by punctuation and used to emphasize meaning. Here is an example from children's verse entitled Sing a Song of Sixpence. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? A caesura will usually occur in the middle of a line of poetry. This caesura is called a medial caesura. Sometimes a caesura will occur at the beginning of a line called an initial caesura, or at the end of the line called a terminal caesura. Stanza. Stanza is a group of lines in a poem. It is often called as verse. Tone. The tone is the feeling that the poets create and the reader senses through the poet's choice of words, rhythm, rhyme, style, and structure. Imagery. Imagery is the author's use of language that appeals to the five senses in order to help the reader imagine exactly what is being described. This is a device by which the poet makes his meaning strong and clear. Diction. The diction is the poet's choice of words and the arrangement of those words used in phrase, sentences, or lines of a poem. The poet chooses each word carefully so that both its meaning and sound contribute to the tone and the feeling of the poem.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Andistua, and I am going to present about figure of speech. Now, what is figure of speech? A figure of speech is just what we call an alterations of normal language in order to achieve a specific effect. The figure of speech in English have long names, many adapted from Greek and Latin by grammarians in the 19th century. We probably use figure of speech all the time without knowing what they are called. So now let's look at the example of figure of speech. Allusion. Allusion is a brief intentional reference to a historical, mythic, or literary person, place, events, or movements. For example, we've got an Einstein here. So basically, we identify the smart person as the great Einstein. Antithesis. It is a combining or contrasting two terms, phrases, or clauses with the opposite meaning. Just for an example is the cloud and the pebble. Love builds a heaven in hell despair. Apostrophe. Apostrophe is speaking to an object or an item that is not alive. For example, come on trousers, you have to fit me. In the example, I am talking to trousers, which is basically a thing. And asyndeton. Asyndeton, it occurs when words like and or coordinating conjunctions removed from the sentences. For example, he received applause, prizes, money, fame. Here in the example, you can see that there is no conjunctions, just purely comma. Chiasmus. Chiasmus is a repetition of any group of verse elements, including a rhyme and grammatical structures, in reverse order, such as the rhyme scheme ABBA. In other words, it is when two sentences are balanced against one another but with the word reverse. For example, John Keats' Ode on a Gracian Urn. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is a figure of speech composed of a striking exaggeration. It uses exaggeration to add more dramatic meaning to a sentence. For example, in James' status line, she scorched you with her radiance. Irony. Irony implies a distance between what is said and what is meant. In other words, it is a statement which conveys the exact opposite meaning of what is literally being said. For example, when William Shakespeare relates in details of how his lover suffers in comparison with the beauty of nature. And my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Now let's proceed to litotes. Litotes is a deliberate understatement for effect, the exact opposite of hyperbole. It is a understatement which implies negative to express the meaning of the affirmative. For example, a good idea may be described as not half bad or difficult task considered. Metaphor. Metaphor is a comparison that made directly. In other words, it is a comparison between two different things which share something in common. For example, John Keats' beauty is truth, truth is beauty from Ode on a Grecian urn. Personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which poet describe an abstraction, a thing, or a non-human form as if it were a person. In other words, it is when an object which is not alive is given human qualities. For example, William Blake's "O Rose, Thou Art Sick." Another example for this is, my alarm clock screams at me every morning. Pun. Pun is a wordplay that uses homonyms, two different words spelled identically, to deliver two or more meanings at the same time. In other words, it is a play on words. An example for this is, an egg for breakfast is not easy to beat. Simile, to compare two things using like or as. For example, in a red rose by Robert Burns declare, oh my love is like red rose, that newly sprung in June. Oh my love is like the melody that sweetly played in tune. Symbol. Symbol is something in the world of the senses, including an actions that revealed or a sign for something else, often abstract or otherworldly. It is defined as object, person, events, places, gestures, etc. that represent something other than itself. For example, dove, it represents peace. Synecdoche. Synecdoche is a figure of speech in which part of something stands for the whole. For example, there were many hired hands in the factory. Synthesia. Synthesia is a blending or intermingling difference of sense of modalities, or in other words, it is a figure of speech where one sense is described in terms of another. For example, the Baudelaire's The Rag Picker's Wine, where he writes the dazzling, deafening, the back of Buggles. Understatement. Understatement is a statement that made to be less important than what is actually being conveyed. For example of this is, I only have $2 million.
Good day, everyone. I'm John Charish Hernandez, and I will discuss literary devices. Literary devices are tools used to enhance meaning, to persuade, to create humor, or to make ideas clearer and more vivid. The different literary devices helps readers to appreciate, interpret, and analyze a literary work. They add more depth by evoking striking images in the reader's mind. First, I will discuss about alliteration. Alliteration. In alliteration, words that begin with the same sound are placed close together, although alliteration often involves repetition of letters. Most importantly, it is a repetition of sounds. Alliteration uses consonant sounds at the beginning of a word to give stress to its syllable. This technique plays a crucial role in poetry by lending a strong rhythm and musical structure to any verse. For example, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe uses alliteration in word pairs. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. In the first three lines of the Raven, there are three examples: weak, weary, quaint, curious, and nodded, nearly napping. Anaphora. Anaphora is a figure of speech in which words repeat at the beginning of successive clauses, phrases, or sentences. Anaphora works as a literary device to allow writers to convey, emphasize, and reinforce meaning. This word repetition at the beginning of each phrase in a group of sentences or clauses is a stylized technique that can be very effective in speeches, lyrics, poetry, and prose. Assonance. For example, the long O sound in Go Slow on the Road or short E sound in Sell the Wedding Bells. Cacophony. Cacophony is the use of combination of words with loud, harsh sounds in reality as well as in literature. In literary studies, this combination of words with rough or unharmonious sounds are used for a noisy or jarring poetic effect. Cacophony is considered the opposite of euphony, which is the use of beautiful, melodious sounding words. For example, he is a rotten, dirty, terrible, trudging, stupid dude. In this example, the cacophonic sound of the sentence mirrors its harsh tone and meaning with hearty sounds in dirty, terrible, and trudging. Hardy sounds in dirty, trudging, and dude, and the hard ST sound in stupid. Consonance. Consonance is a literary device that refers to the repetition of the same consonant sounds in a line of text. The focus in the use of consonants is on the sound made by consonants and not necessarily the letter themselves. These alike sounds can appear anywhere in the word, but will usually be found at its end or middle or at the end of the stressed syllable. For example, Peter, patter, twist, and shout. The next one, elision. An elision is the removal of part of a word to shorten it. This might be an unstressed syllable, consonant, or letter from a word or phrase. For example, it is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. The word wandering is an example here. Shakespeare shortened it from wandering in order to take out an extra syllable. Euphony. The literary device euphony is derived from the Greek word euphonous, which means sweet-voiced. It can be defined as the use of words and phrases that are distinguished as having a wide range of noteworthy melody or loveliness in the sound they create. It gives pleasing and soothing effects to the ear due to repeated vowels and smooth consonants. Euphony involves the use of long vowel sounds, which are more melodious than consonants. Euphony involves the use of harmonious consonants such as L, M, N, R, and soft F and V sounds. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is one way a poet can create sounds in a poem. It is a word that actually looks like the sound it makes, and we can almost hear those words as we read. For example, the animal noise such as meow, roar, buzz, oink, and woof. Repetition. Repetition is a literary device that involves using the same word or phrase over and over again in a piece of writing or speech. Writers of all kinds use repetition, but it is particularly popular in oration and spoken word where a listener's attention might be more limited. For example, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow, or sorry, not sorry. Rhyme and rhythm. The concept of rhythm and rhyme refers to a pattern of rhymes that is created by using words that produce the same or similar sounds. Rhythm and rhyme together refers to the recurrence of a similar sound in prose and poetry, creating a musical and gentle effect. Allegory. An allegory is a story, poem, or work of art that has a hidden meaning or message, usually a moral, and allegories use characters and events to convey a meaning rather than stating the message. Sometimes, with allegories, the message is obvious, but more often than not it is hidden, and reader has to dig deep into the poem to try to uncover it. The message might be contained within a double meaning in characters' words or a narrator's description. It might also be found in symbols or actions. Even events occurring in the background can have powerful implications. Cliche. A cliche is a trite, overused expression that can be found in writing and in everyday life. It is used most often to describe expressions, but it might also be used more broadly to speak about ideas, images, plot events, characters, or stories that are overused and unoriginal. Idioms. Idiom is an expression with a figurative or metaphorical meaning that differs from its literal meaning. Like, for example, one of the most common idiom is break a leg or you're barking up the wrong tree. You're barking up the wrong tree. Euphemism. Euphemism is a figure of speech most commonly used to replace a word or phrase that is related to a concept that might make others uncomfortable. Euphemism refers to figurative language designed to replace phrasing that would otherwise be considered harsh, impolite, or unpleasant. For example, porcelain throne, which means toilet, big boned, overweight, between jobs, unemployed, split, or divorce. And lastly, parallelism. Parallelism is the repetition of grammatical elements in writing and speaking. Parallelism influences the grammatical structure of sentences but can also impact the meaning of thoughts and ideas being presented. One of the most common examples are fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, and when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. And those are the literary devices. Thank you.
I am May Angelica B. Columna, and I will be discussing poetry genres and their types. Poetry has three main genres: lyric, dramatic, and narrative, and each of these three genres can be further divided into subgroups or types. First is narrative poetry. It tells a story but through poetic verses. It has a plot, characters, and a setting, and often includes action and dialogue. The story is narrated through a third person's point of view or from a third person perspective. Now let us head on to its types. First, we have allegory. It is a narrative poem that uses an extended metaphor to make a point. The characters, places, and objectives in a narrative carry figurative meaning. This means that a story has an underlying meaning, or in other words, it is a story with two meanings, a literal meaning and a figurative one. Second, ballad. Narrative poetry set to music. It typically consists of a series of 4-line stanzas. Ballads generally tell of an event of interest such as crime. They were originally sung or recited as an oral tradition among rural societies and were often anonymous retellings of local legends and stories. Burlesque, a mock epic poem that tells an ordinary story in a melodramatic way. It mocks or mimics a subject such as a social problem, a specific person, another literary work or author through ridicule and outrageous imagery. Epic, a lengthy poem that tells a story of heroic adventures. It celebrates heroic deeds and events and usually focuses on a single heroic individual. Epics are written in a grandiose style and tell stories based on historical events or legends of cultural importance. The second genre is lyric poetry. In lyric poetry, the mood is melodic and emotional. It uses song-like and emotional words to describe a moment, an object, a feeling, or a person. It does not necessarily tell a story but focus on the poet's personal attitudes and state of mind. Rather than telling a story, the writer is able to express his or her state of mind, perceptions, and feelings. They tend to be shorter and contemplative. They use sensory language to set the scene and inspire emotions in the reader. Sensory language are the words used to create images that trigger the reader's senses, such as sight, sound, smell, and taste. It also allows the readers to let their imagination flow and fill in any missing pieces in literature, similar to when we are reading a fantasy book. Types of lyric poetry. First, we have elegy, a reflective poem to honor the dead. Many elegiac poems are about mourning and seeking consolation for a loss of some kind. They usually follow a specific pattern: grief, praise, and comfort. It is not to be confused with eulogy, which is an account that is put together in prose. Second, ode, an elevated poem that pays tribute or is dedicated to or praises a person, idea, place, or concept. Sonnet, a descriptive 14-line poem with a specific rhyme scheme. It was originally a love poem which dealt with the lover's sufferings and hopes, so love is usually the main theme in sonnets. Other themes include religious experiences, reflections on art, or even experiences in war. The last two are both poetic forms that originate in Japan. The haiku is a 17-syllable poem that uses natural imagery to express an emotion. Haiku must contain seasonal words called kigo, and the image and emotion of each seasonal word affect the entire poem. It consists of 3 lines with a 5-7-5 pattern and structure. Tanka, which translates to short song, expresses the intense, spontaneous feeling of the poet and evoke a moment or mark on occasion with concision and musicality. It is usually in the form of 5 lines of about 31 syllables in a sequence 5-7-5-7-7. The last poetic genre is dramatic poetry, also known as dramatic verse or verse drama. It both tells a story or portrays a situation and connects the reader to an audience through emotions or behavior. So it's kind of like a combination of the narrative poetry and the lyric poetry in terms of its purpose. It is meant to be spoken, acted, or sung. It is usually in the form of dramatic or even comedic monologues or soliloquies written in a rhyming verse. Unlike narrative poetry, though, wherein the story is told by a narrator, or dramatic poetry is written from the perspective of the character in the story. Types of dramatic poetry. First, we have monologue. From the word mono, is a speech given by one character to another or by one character to the audience. The speaker's personality and character, his relationship to others, his sense of values and attitudes towards life are indirectly gleaned from his monologue. Soliloquy, a speech given by one character to himself or herself, a dramatic representation of inner monologue. The thoughts and emotions expressed and the revelations made freely and without inhibition give deep insights into the character and inform the audience about other developments in the play. Character sketch. The writer is concerned less with matters of story, complete or implied, than he is with arousing sympathy, antagonism, or merely interest for an individual. In other words, the poet serves as an observer and commentator, and their main goal is to make the audience feel something for the character, rather than to move the plot along to create a more memorable theater experience. And the last type of dramatic poetry is dialogue, a dramatic way to portray thoughts and images by using two characters, real, imagined, or divine, who exchange lines to direct action, give information, or tell something about themselves. In summary, narrative poetry is written to tell a story, lyric poetry to evoke emotions, and dramatic poetry to express a character's point of view. Now let us head on to poetic forms.
Poetic forms consist of form, line, stanza, rhyme, sound of a word. First, we're going to talk about the generic kind of forms, which includes meter, rhyme, forms, and sounds. The first example of generic form is the couplet. A couplet is a pair of successive lines of meter in poetry. A couplet usually consists of two successive lines that rhyme and have the same meter. The famous example of couplet is from the Sonnet 55 of William Shakespeare. So tell the judgment that yourself arise, you live in this and dwell in lover's eyes. The Sonnet 55 has 10 syllables and have the same rhyme at the end of every lines. Next is a triplet. A triplet is tercet and has 3 rhyming lines. This configuration is labeled as AAA. And the example of triplet is from Walt Whitman from his poem There's Though Now Also. The poem is no map there nor guide, nor voice sounding, nor touch of human hand, nor face with blooming flesh, no lips nor eyes are in that land. Quatrain. A quatrain is a stanza in a poem that has exactly 4 lines. Quatrains usually use some form of rhyme scheme, especially the following forms: the AAA, AABB, ABAB, ABBA. Lines in quatrain can be any length and with any meter, but there is usually a regular rhyme to a lines as well. The example of quatrain is from the poem of William Blake. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, wept, 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 wept. Sir, your chimneys I swept, and in sooth I sleep. As you observe from the poem, the form of rhyme is AABB, which is the first and the second line is rhyme, and then the third and the fourth line was rhyme. The next one is refrain. In poetry, a refrain is a repeated word, line, or a group of lines that appears at the end of a stanza. Refrain is a poetic device that uses repetition to place emphasis on a set of words or an idea within a poem. The famous example of refrain is from Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. It was many and many years ago in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know. I was a child and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. As you observe from the poem, there is a repeated words, and that was called refrain. Ballad. The ballad is a poem that is typically arranged in quatrains with rhyme scheme ABAB. Ballads are usually narrative, which means they tell a story. Ballads begins as folk songs and continue to be used today in modern music. The famous ballad is from Samuel Taylor, Water, Water Everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. As you observe, the first line and the third line is rhyme, and the second and the last line or the fourth line is rhyme. The next is the blank verse. Blank verse is poetry written with regular metrical but unrhymed lines, almost iambic pentameter, which means verse that consisting of a short syllable and one followed by a long syllable. The famous example of blank verse is from William Shakespeare from his Hamlet, To Be or Not to Be. I'm not gonna read the whole poem. However, I'm gonna say that blank verse is somehow one of the easiest form of poetry because we are not gonna think about the rhymes. Next one is drop line. In poetry, a drop line is a line which is broken into two lines, but where the second part is indented to the horizontal position, it will have had as an broken line. The example of drop line is Iris by Jackie Castillo. As you observe from the example, there are broken lines. When we see that there is a broken line in a poem, that was called drop line. The next one is Tetrasites. This was interesting kind of poem. Tetrasites is a 5-line syllables form starting with one syllable for line 1. Each line then adds a syllable until the 5th line, which has 10 syllables. To rhyme or not to rhyme, you can choose. The example of Tetrasites is from Ray Stebbing. The I poems displaying a shapely form accepting auditions from needless stress. From one syllable to 10 syllable in 5th line. The next one is Stigmatea. Stigmatea is a dialogue especially of altercation or dispute delivered by two actors in alternating lines. The simple example of Stigmatea is no I didn't, yes you did, no I didn't, yes you did. The next one will be light verse. Light verse, a poetry on trivial or playful themes that is written primarily to amuse and entertain, and that often involves the use of nonsense and word play. The example of light verse is from James Edward Lee Sr. I cares your spirit heart, I ease your thoughts, I shall kiss the air you breathe, I will carry you beyond the breeze, I love you as God loves us, you are my special trust, I so endeavor to be just yours, only your forever. The last example from generic form is the spoken poetry word, a broad designation for poetry intended for performance. characterized by rhyme, repetition, improvisation, and wordplay. Spoken word poems frequently refers to issues of social justice, politics, race, and community. Spoken poetry word is somehow you know familiar for us already because it was I know lahat tayo naranasan na po ang gumawa gawin ang spoken poetry and somehow spoken word poetry is interesting because somewhat the story of spoken poetry is relate to us. The next example of poetic form is the complex whole form poem forms, which consist of serious compression of information in very few words. The first example of complex whole poem forms is the sonnet. Sonnet has 14 lines, of iambic pentameter linked by an intricate rhyme scheme. Iambic pentameter refers to its rhyme. Basically, each lines of poems has 10 syllables, and every other syllables is stressed. And I know that sonnet is also familiar to us because it was already studied in our senior high school. The next example is the villanelle. A villanelle, also known as Villaneschi, is a 19-line poetic form consisting of 5 tercet followed by a quatrain. Here is the example of villanelle by Dylan Thomas. His famous poem, "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night." Villanelle is somehow a long kind of poem. I'm not gonna read the poem. However, as you observe, it has 6 stanza, consists of 5 tercet, or the stanza has 3 lines, and the last one is the consists of quatrains, which has 4 lines. The next one is Sistina. Sistina consists of 6 stanzas of 6 unrhyming lines, followed by the envoy of 3 lines, or the short stanza at the end of the form. The lines are almost always of regular length and are usually an iambic pentameter, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one, or the iambic, and with lines of 10 syllables, with 5 of them are stressed or pentameter.
Hi everyone, this is Anna Faith and I will be discussing the other 3 complex whole poems. So let's start with Ghazal. So Ghazal, it is a poem originated in Arabic poetry. It deals with loss and romantic love and usually speaks about deep metaphysical question of life. It is also about love and longing, and it is usually melancholy and reserved. It is composed of minimum of 5 couplets with repeated and rhyming words. Each couplet ends on the same word known as radif and is preceded by the couplet's rhyming words, which is known as kafia, and twice in the first couplet and then once in every couplet after. So as I've searched with the Ghazal, I've found a poem made by Makhyoug, which is the Ghazal of the Better Unbegun. So in the poem, the word person was repeated in the first couplet, and it is repeated once in every couplet. So sometimes a poet will choose to include something personal in the last couplet. This might be a reference to the author, their name, or a signature, but in Makhyoug's case, he included his last name. So let's move on to the other poetic forms, which is the pantome. It is a repetitive form from Malay, and it is originated from Malaysia, which is a short folk poem. So it is a Malaysian verse form adapted by French poets and occasionally imitated in English. It is comprises a series of quatrains. The pantome is a poem of any length composed of 4-line stanzas in which the second and fourth lines of a quatrain recur as the first and third lines of the succeeding quatrain. So pantome consists of a series of quatrains rhyming AB AB. Each quatrain introduces a new second rhyme as BC, BC, and CD, CD. So to help you understand, I provided an example of the poetic form pantome, and let's analyze the poem. So here is an example of the pantome poem entitled "It All Started with a Packet of Seeds." So as we read the poem, we can observe that in line 5 and line 2, they are the same. To be planted with tenderness and care. And same with line 7, it is repeated with line 4. At the base of an oak, free from all weeds. The ending stanzas repeats the second and fourth lines of the previous stanza, and then also repeats the third line of the first stanza as its fourth. I know it sounds complicated, but let's analyze the last stanza of the poem. So in the last stanza, the very first stanza for the last stanza is from the line 2 of the previous stanza, and line 3 from the first stanza, line 4 from the previous stanza, and line 1 of first stanza. You can continue with as many stanzas as you want, since it is a poem form of any length. So you can observe the lines from the previous stanzas and the first stanza repeated in last quatrain. So the first line of the poem is also the last stanza of the poem. So we have the Rondeau. It is a poem originated in France. It began as a lyric form in 13th century France, popular among medieval court poets and musicians. So Rondeau is composed of rhyming quintet, quatrain, and sestet. There is a rhyming scheme that the poem follows: AABBA, AABR, AABBAR, which the letter R stands for the refrain. The other lines are long, but all of the same metrical length. So line 9 and 15 of the poem are short. So here is an example of the poem, Springtime Air. It only has 2 rhymes, with the opening words used twice as an unrhyming refrain at the end of the second and third stanzas. So as we read the poem, we can observe the rhyming scheme of the poem. That's all for the complex whole poetic forms. So now let's move on to the other poetic forms, the short whole poem forms. So first is the Clerihew. It is invented by Edmund Clerihew Bentley, 1875 to 1956. A Clerihew is simply a 4-line poem rhyming AABB that makes fun of somebody famous. Clerihew invented the poem at the age of 16. The poem is about or deals with a person or character within the first rhyme. In most cases, the first line names a person, and the second line ends with something that rhymes with the name of the person. So here is an example of the Clerihew. Sir Humphrey Davy abominated gravy. He lived in the odium of having discovered sodium. It is one of the most remembered Clerihew from Bentley's collection. So in the poem, we can observe that the first line is someone whose name is a person, with is Humphrey Davy, and then next is something that describes the person but rhymes with the name of the person. So now let's move on to the other poetic form, which is haiku. Haiku is a Japanese form of poetry. It began in the 13th century Japan, consisting of 3 unrhymed lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. usually focuses on nature or seasons. As the opening phrase of Ranga, an oral poem, generally 100 stanzas long. It is a 17 syllables all in all, and usually written in present tense. So the 575 syllables was made for children in order for them to understand the poem. So I provided an example of haiku. Pink cherry blossoms cast shimmering reflections on seas of Japan. So it is a 17 syllables all in all, and it is focusing on the nature. So now let's move on with the other poem, which is the tanka. It is also an ancient Japanese form of poetry, originated in the 7th century and quickly became the preferred verse form not only in the Japanese imperial court. It has a 575 syllable count. Tankas typically present a whole story or picture within the 31 syllables. So I provided an example of tanka. So these poems are traditionally about seasons, desires, or feelings and often includes different literary devices. So here is the difference between tanka and haiku. Haiku uses the 575 syllable count form while 57577 was in tanka. Haiku is written in 3-line poem whereas tanka is written in 5-line poem. Haiku is written more concrete and objective, whereas tanka is written in more subjectively and emotionally about human feelings and experiences. Ambahan, an indigenous poetry of the Hanunoo Mangyan of Mindoro Province. Antoon Postma, a Dutch anthropologist, linguist, and former missionary priest from the Society of the Divine Word, started researching about the Mangyans. Postma was very dedicated to research about the Mangyans until he found out about their poetry. Ambahan contains 2 to over 100 lines, with each line having 7 syllables ending in rhyme, and Ambahan also uses metaphors. It contains vivid symbols taken from the Mangyans' experiential knowledge of plants, animals, nature, and man. Metaphors are used to portray something like deep experiences to symbolize inner, rich reality. Postma defines Ambahan as a set of poetic expressions with a measured rhyme of 7 syllable lines, having rhyming end syllables, vocalized as a chant without a determined melody or too much melodic variation, without the accompaniment of musical instruments, recited for the purpose of verbalizing in a metaphorical way certain human situations or characteristics, with the possible challenge of matching answer in dialogue fashion, and lastly, in the presence of an interested audience of various size. So here is an example of the poem Ambahan. It is also translated in English. In this Ambahan, the boy uses 2 plants to compare the girls he is courting and explain reasons for his choice through the use of the poem Ambahan. So Ambahan poems are expressed in 2 forms. It is chanted or recited in social circles or inscribed on bamboo tubes or slates to be sent as letters to the recipient. So I provided the photo of the inscribed on bamboo tubes made by the Mangyans. So next is the Tanaga. Tanaga is a short Filipino poem, traditionally do not have any titles. It consists of 4 lines with 7 syllables each with the same rhyme at the end of each line. So Tanaga is a poetic form that should speak about themselves. So unlike Ambahan, whose length is indefinite, the Tanaga is a compact 7-syllable quatrain. So that is to say, a 7-7-7-7 syllabic verse with an AAAA rhyme scheme. So modern Tanaga still uses the 7-7-7 syllabic count, but rhymes range from dual rhyme forms. Also, in modern Tanaga, you can have a title, but it is also optional. So next is Textula. Textula is also a Filipino short poem. It is a poem written in the form of text messages, usually consisting of 1 or 2 stanzas. This poem is usually in Tagalog language. It is sent as a direct communication to a person close to the sender. Rhyme schemes in Textula may vary. So, the rhyme schemes, basic or AAA rhyming scheme, enclosed, alternate, or the AABB rhyme scheme. So I also provided an example for Textula. So Textula is a poem which doesn't have to win in a competition. However, it can be a tanaga shared through texting. So next is the poem Dalit. Same with the previous poem, it is also a short Filipino poem consisting of 4 lines with 8 syllables each. Dalit literature is a body text produced by writers whose caste background used to be referred to as untouchable or schedule caste, and whose writing engages with caste, discrimination, and Indian life from a Dalit point of view. So, in Dalit poetry, there is a controversy regarding its origin. Some thought it came from Spanish in origin, hence it is said that the Spanish popularized Dalit in the Philippines. I provided an example of Dalit. So let's move forward with the other poetic forms. Diona. It is another indigenous or native Tagalog poetic form. It is composed of 3 lines with 7 syllables with monorhyme, or 3 lines containing 8 syllables each that all rhyme with one another. A Diona is a pre-Hispanic rhyming poem. So in the poem, you can observe the rhyming scheme and the syllable count form. Next is the cinquain. A cinquain is a 5-line poem that was invented by Adelaide Crapsey in the early 20th century. Adelaide Crapsey is an American poet who took her inspiration from Japanese haiku and tanka. So we have different types of cinquains. First is the didactic cinquain. This type of cinquain poem uses words instead of using syllables and stresses. I also provided on how to write cinquains. I also provided an example. Reverse cinquain. In reverse cinquain, an American cinquain is followed by a reversed American cinquain. So this is a cinquain with the traditional syllable pattern reversed. So next is the mirror cinquain. It is a 10-line poem. It consists of the original cinquain followed by the reversed cinquain. So in the format, line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the original cinquain, and then 6 to 10 is the reversed cinquain. Next is the butterfly cinquain. It is a 9-line poem. It is a 9-line poem where the last line of the original cinquain is merged with the first line of a reversed cinquain. Crown cinquain, a sequence of 5 cinquains used to construct one large 25-line poem. It is a 5-stanza line poem, so I also provided an example for the crown cinquain. Garland cinquain, a series of 6 cinquain. The last is constructed of lines from the first 5. So here is the format for the Garland cinquain. Line 1 is from stanza 1, and so on and so forth. So here is an example of the crown cinquain. So next poetic form is the epigram. Epigrams are short satirical poems ending with either a humorous retort or a stinging punchline. An epigram is a short and witty statement usually written in verse. The subject is usually a single thought or event. Most common forms are written as a couplet, a pair of rhymed lines in the same meter. It originated from the Greek word epigramma. So here is an example of the epigram. This example is from Oscar Wilde, who was one of the famous and skilled writers for using epigrams. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about and that is not being talked about. Oscar Wilde. Next is the epitaph. An epitaph is a brief poem inscribed on a tombstone praising a deceased person, usually with rhyming lines. It derived from the Greek word epitaphios. Epitaph is a short text on a plaque or tombstone, as I've said, honoring a dead person. It also means as a funeral oration. So here is an example of the epitaph. This epitaph poem by Will describes that death is also like a prison. This epitaph of Will's is inscribed on his gravestone. Limerick, a 5-line stanza poem that consists of a single stanza. Consists of a rhyme scheme of AABBA. A rhymed humorous or nonsense poem with traditional limericks. The first, second, and fifth lines feature the same verbal rhythm, rhyme, and have 7 to 10 syllables. The third and fourth lines must rhyme, feature the same rhythm, and have 5 to 7 syllables. So most limericks are intended to be humorous. A limerick poem is usually appeared as a nursery rhyme poem, and here is an example of the most widely recited, which is the Hickory Dickory Dock. So next is the monostich. A monostich is a single-line poem which expresses a complete thought. It should express a complete idea. The monostich took off in American literature in the 1920s. The line should stand by itself. It is often in response to haiku and the poets championing this form. So here is an example of the monostich. Regret by Robert Lee Brewer. I hold a cheap bag that only holds cramps. So, prose poem. A work in prose that has some of the technical or literary qualities of a poem. Demonstrates other traits such as symbols, metaphors, and other figures of speech. Prose poetry exists in many cultures around the world. So, prose is ordinary language that follows regular grammatical conventions and does not contain a formal metrical structure. However, in prose poem, it has the literary qualities of a poem. Although there is no fixed definition of prose poetry, it still has the qualities and elements involved to its format. So we have the alliteration, repetition, implied metrical structure or rhythmic structure, rhyming language, literary devices. So here is an example of the prose poetry. This example is from the poem Spring Day by the American poet Amy Lowell. So that is all for the poetic forms. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Gemini De Terra and I will be presenting you reading poetry. So, in reading and understanding poetry, a reader must take into consideration the 4 types that provide meaning to a poetic piece. Let's begin with denotative. Denotation is a word's literal or dictionary definition. It is an important literary device that allows writers conciseness in describing or conveying moods and actions to their readers. A common example would be how we tend to generalize ideas, such as, do you like movies? Contextually, movies would either be referring to a genre, like romance, or a specific film, such as In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai. The opposite of denotation is connotative, or connotation. Connotation refers to an implied meaning of a word that goes beyond its dictionary definition. This is a literary device associated with figurative language, which are the metaphorical or symbolic meaning of a word. Let's go over the 2 types. Metaphorical, or a metaphor, is a figurative type of language as well as a literary device that creates comparisons between 2 distinctive things. It generates an impression that two things have identical values rather than simply being similar. It is a worthy tool in writing visuals as well as to explain abstract concepts. A good example would be comparing your beloved's stature to be as fine as jade. Whereas symbolic or symbolism utilizes the use of symbols in a literary work. A symbol for which it represents an object, action, character, or concept that embodies a wide range of significance and meaning. From the previous example on metaphors, I compared this one's beloved to be fine jade. In China, jade is highly valued for its beauty and elegance, but also for what it symbolizes, such as kindness, virtue, sincerity, the truth, etc. Generally, a word may either have a positive or negative connotation depending on the social, cultural, and personal context it is being used in. For instance, a merchant trying to fend off a traveler from haggling a discount on his apples says, "Good heavens, you are a cheap one." The negative connotation of the word cheap is that the merchant is telling the traveler he's poor. But the traveler defends by saying, "You call it cheap, I call it being thrifty." Thrifty as its positive connotation of the word cheap. In reading and writing poetry, it is crucial to take into account denotation, connotation, and its metaphors and symbols, as it provides greater depth into its meaning as well as it increases the artistic value of a poetic piece. The use of the aphronamed is beneficial for several different reasons. Here are some benefits of figurative language use in poetry. The first one is very self-explanatory. It provides more dimension as it creates a more vivid piece to entice the reader's imagination. The second one is that it allows us to express more with fewer words. Often we find ourselves elaborating an idea with really long paragraphs. A symbol or a metaphor from a poem could convey more than expounding on one's idea with a lot of sentences. A line from one of Lu Xiaolin's poems says, "Envy only a pair of mandarin ducks and not the immortals," which means true love is better than cultivating into immortality. Also because mandarin ducks mate for life. I could be writing a lot of words to express how life is better with the person you love most than being single for the rest of your life. But this one line, the symbolic use of mandarin ducks, encapsulates what Lu Xiaolin was trying to express, which is what good is being immortal and alone than somebody loving you until you grow old. Pretty romantic if you ask me. The last and final benefit is that figurative language amplifies our imagery and sensory to engage our emotions. This helps in creating a sensuous and visceral immersive experience. To conclude, if you wish to write or understand poetry, studying the choice of words and what it denotes and connotes, as well as what it figuratively implies from other poems, may aid you in your poetic endeavor. That sums up my entire report. I hope you learned something, and thank you very much for listening.
How to write poetry. Poetry has no official sanctioned rules, which make it hard to define. However, as with all creative writing, having some degree of structure can help you ring your ideas and work productively. Unlike prose, poetry is aesthetic by nature and has a sound, cadence, rhyme, meter, and etc. that adds to its meaning. Traditional poetry uses regular rhyming, which helps to aid the memory for recitation and gives predictable pleasure. It also has a pattern of rhyme called scheme that also helps to establish the form of the poetry. But nowadays, a lot of modern poetry does not rhyme, follows no formal structure or a free-form structure, and does not use any specific vocabulary and be about any specific topic. If you are a beginner and unexperienced, this kind of method would be a great start for you. Poetry does not need to rhyme. Sometimes we intend to do a forced rhyming which makes it unpleasant to hear and unnatural to read. Let's just keep in mind that the important thing in writing a poetry isn't whether or not it rhymes. It is whether or not it resonates. What it do have to do is to use words artistically by employing figurative languages such as literary devices. Poetry is a form of creative writing, so it must have an artistic expression in conveying the emotions and ideas in telling the stories. It teaches lessons and even communicate hidden messages. As it is drawn on the imagination, the meaning must be conveyed through the use of imagery, narrative, and drama. To have further knowledge about how to write poetry, here are some guidelines and tips to help you understand more about it. Let's start with the 3 fundamental guidelines in poetry. Number 1. Keep your goal in mind. And that goal is to provoke emotion in the readers or listeners. To make it possible, we should show or use various kinds of text to allow the readers or listeners to experience the story through action, words, thoughts, senses, and feelings rather than just tell or being direct by giving an exposition, summarization, and description about the topic. We should give and allow them to picture or imagine the sceneries in their minds. Don't just tell. By this, you are just directly informing them. This lacks them to experience the essence of a stanza in the poetry. Number 2. Less can be more. Writing long, flowery verse is perfectly acceptable, but using simple, concise language is also powerful. Simplicity is better than to elaborate embellishment. Sometimes, something simple can be better than something advanced or complicated. By this, we can avoid to overdo something or some parts of the poetry, and the readers or listeners will easily comprehend the topic. Number 3. Be creative and explore. It is okay to break grammatical rules. By doing so, it helps you to be creative as you express yourself. But keep in mind that breaking rules is not the same as making mistakes. And what I meant by that are misspelled words, incorrect punctuation, cliches, being melodramatic, abusing figure of speech, enforcing rhyme or meter, and etc. Now, here are some 5 tips to help you get started in writing poetry. Step 1. Decide what you want to write. The very first step in writing poetry is to decide or know what your topic is going to be about. Free writing can be a helpful exercise as well as writing prompt as a jumping point or just jot down a word or few which can serve as a guide. Look for inspiration around you, perhaps in nature, community, current events, or it can be the people in your life. Take note on how different things make you feel and what they drive you to think about. Once you have a topic and theme, the next step is to determine the best format for your poetry. As I said earlier, your poetry doesn't have to adhere to any specific format, but choosing one and sticking to it might be the way to go. By opting to write in a particular format, you constrain your writing and force yourself to find a way to creatively express your theme while fitting that format's constraints. Step 3. Explore words, rhymes, and rhythm. Read and explore other poetries that has the same format as yours. It can give you an idea or template to follow. A specific rhythm or rhyme scheme can highlight your themes and clever wordplay in your poetry. Fourth step. Write the poetry. Now that you got some ideas and plan, you can now write your poetry. Give yourself some uninterrupted time to focus and do not rush or pressure yourself. The first tries will never be something perfect. Try to avoid getting frustrated and instead give your mind some time to get good words out. Write what's on your mind, and it doesn't matter if it does not rhyme or the syllables does not fit. The theme your words are expressing is more important than the specific words themselves, and you can always revise afterwards. Last step: edit what you've written. Edit your draft. It would be more better if you take a break first. Then, in a day or two, come back and read again your poetry. Take note of any spots where you can replace a word with a stronger one. Tighten your rhythm. Make your imagery more vivid, or even remove words or stanzas that are not adding anything. Changing to another form is okay as long as it works better. Reading it aloud can also effectively help you as you listen to it. You'll be able to hear its rhythm and notice some spots that doesn't quite work. Sharing and asking for feedback to somebody else like a friend or a teacher will help you in your improvement. Getting critiques will surely help you as long as you don't get it in a negative way. Thank you, reporters, for the very informative discussion about poetry. Your efforts are very much appreciated. Congratulations to all of us, and on behalf of my group and I, Nadine Disuyo, would like to thank you for listening, and we hope you guys gain further knowledge about understanding poetry. If there are any questions and clarifications, please do not hesitate to ask us after this video. Thank you.